Okay, guys, so welcome to our final lecture on Plato, where we will kind of wrap things up and look at the more philosophical aspects of the text. So, first of all, in particular, we're going to be focusing on part 7, the philosopher ruler. So, first of all, again, let's, like we always do, take a step back and try to recall what we discussed last week, right? So last week we spoke about what exactly is Plato's overall project, right? What is the idea behind the Republic? Essentially, that it is a political proposal that Plato is trying to put forth in order to argue for a alternative form of governance, but not any alternative form of governance, a form of governance that is grounded in what he regards to be truth, what he regards to be true. And we said that this is essentially an interplay between philosophy and politics, and that this interplay is not something new, and that philosophy and politics were always, in one way or another, intertwined. But for Plato, he is making the explicit philosophical argument about why Athenian politics should be grounded in a particular philosophy, which is the Platonic philosophy, the idea of the ideal forms and the good and so forth. So let's start off with the central argument, right? The central argument, which is also the underlying assumption throughout the debates that we have seen so far in the text, are on the idea of justice, right? The idea that any state should essentially be based on and grounded in justice. Now, one of the first problems that emerges when one makes the claim that a state should be based on justice is, first and foremost, does justice even exist as a value, as something that is tangible, concrete, something that we can discover? Or is it something that is subjective, something that we create? Is it essentially a social construct? Meaning, is justice what the majority or a minority deem it to be? So are the meanings of justice changing from time to time? Now, clearly, the argument that Plato is putting forth is that no, justice is a state of being. It is a condition. So what I mean by that is, for example, if I talk of a healthy person, I am talking about an objective state of being. So similarly, Plato is trying to argue that justice is not a subjective ideal or value. It is not a social construct. It is something that is attained, something that is discovered, right? And because it is something that is external to us, and because it is something that is objective, the question then becomes, well, how do we discover it? How do we reach it? Right? How do we know it? Now, this pertains to the question of what we call epistemology, right? So it is one thing to say that justice exists externally to me, right? It is another thing for me to ask, how do I get to justice? How do I know it? Right? Question of knowledge. And again, this is a very fundamental question for political philosophy, right? For any political mode of governance. How do we know what we know? And how do we establish certain values? So do we know them through the laws of nature, right? Do we use the scientific method? Do we use philosophical speculation? Do we use rational thinking? What are the methods through which we can discover the truth? So here we are essentially talking about tools, right? We're talking about tools. If I were to ask you to uh, give me a set of observations about planetary movements, right? You would use a particular tool, right? You would use a telescope. Whereas if I were to ask you what is the organic structure of a chemical compound, you would use a microscope, right? So intuitively, you would choose the adequate tool for the subject that you are trying to understand. So the question before us now is that even if we were to concede to Plato, I'm recording a lecture, okay? Even if we were to concede to Plato that justice exists objectively, the question then becomes, okay, that's great, but how do we discover it? Now, in the previous sections, Plato kind of sets up a dilemma, which is that he discusses how there are some individuals, or most individuals, are predisposed towards their natural interests, right? Their needs and their wants, and that the knowledge that they have is in many cases the case with the guardians and the merchants and traders and artisans, that they have a certain type of worldly knowledge. So, for example, knowledge about trade, about military strategy, and so forth. So then, how can these individuals ascertain or discover the truth, right? Using what method? Obviously, you cannot approach the question of justice with the same tools that you would use, for example, to calculate whether or not you should set the price of grain to be 50 liras or 20 liras, right? You need a different type of tool. Similarly, can we use military strategy or the knowledge, the methods that we employ, the empirical strategic methods that we employ in knowing military strategies? Can we employ that in trying to discover what is justice? Clearly not, right? So this brings us to a dilemma for Plato, which is, okay, given what you've told us about the polis, about the people that make up the city-state, who is tasked and who has the capacity to know what is justice, right? To discover it. Who has the tools needed? And another dilemma is, what happens when different classes claim to have discovered different conceptions of what is true and what is not true, what is just and what is unjust? So now Plato tackles this head on by saying, well, first and foremost, there is the observable fact that humans are not equal, like we discussed, right? That humans naturally have different aptitudes and are predisposed to be good at different things. Some of us are artistic, some of us are logical, some of us are more courageous, and so forth. Similarly, there is a class of people who, if properly trained, can become philosophers. And philosophers have the capability, have the tools, and have the inner qualities necessary, okay, to discover and to essentially transcend this world of illusions and shadows and discover what is true. So this again is the reason why Plato argues that uh, that those who should be tasked with governing the state, those who should be tasked with the kingship of the state, are the philosopher kings. So now to delve into today's talk. Plato begins with a very interesting thesis. And he states that, he makes as a categorical statement that we all aspire to live in light of the truth. meaning that the desire of man and woman cannot be reduced to self-interest or to the everyday horizon that makes up our mundane routines, but also that man always aspires to live in light of what he or she deems to be the truth. And this is an interesting observation. Right? This is a very interesting observation precisely because it calls into question a lot of the observations that we have about contemporary politics and the idea of politics as essentially power games, power struggles, and competition of interests, diverging interests, and so forth. Now, given that we all aspire to live in light of the truth, and that not all of us have the ability to access the truth, what we need to do is to institute a division of labor which allows the philosophers to discover the truth and to rule us according to it. Now, there are a series of assumptions in this statement. The first is that human beings have a disposition towards what is true, and not just a disposition to what is in their interests or to what is pleasurable, right? So here we are talking about, this is an assumption about human nature. The second is that the truth, as we noted, exists external. It is objective, it is not subjective, and it has to be discovered. It is not something that we create. This is an ontological assumption, an assumption about what is, about what exists. It is to say that just truth exists as an entity, as a state, independently outside of the human mind. Right? So it has a certain form of existence. And third, that not only does the truth exist externally to us, but that we also have the capacity to discover it. Okay? Again, this is a significant point in and of itself, because one could argue that, for example, as many of us would in today's scientific age and so forth, that while there are certain mysteries in the universe that have answers, but we don't know them yet. Or, for example, time. What is time? What is the consciousness? How is everything interconnected? And these what are the origins of the universe? So many, for example, scientists or philosophers of science make the argument that there are answers to these questions, right? But we cannot know them. For example, Thomas Nagel and Colin McGill and this idea and so forth. Plato is saying no, not only do they exist, but we can discover them. Now, Plato needs to defend these three assumptions, right? Let's start with the first one. On what basis can we say that man is disposed towards living under what is true? To defend this, he makes the argument that the soul is essentially three parts, right? You have reason, desire, and ambition. Now, desires and ambitions promote self-interest, but reason is what disposes us to the truth, right? Now, it's if you want to think about this in practical ways, right? The relationship that every human has: reason, ambition, and desires. So we all run into this, right? This is not a difficult assumption to try to understand. We all have the desire, for example, to do something that we know is that we rationally know is harmful to our health, right? If somebody has cholesterol, and they want to eat, for example, a sweet or a cake, right? Rationally, you know that this is not correct. That, I mean, this is detrimental to your health, but your desire still pushes you um, towards towards doing so, right? So Plato here is arguing that there are three competing and three conflicting components within the human soul, and that essentially um, uh, one of them prevails over the other, right? Similarly, the distinction between reason and desires is also straightforward, right? Desires arise within us without a consideration of what is good and bad, right? These are the headphones.
You have an extra one that I can.
When I finish, I'll give you these. So, uh, so in the case of desires, right? Um, when you desire something, you do not begin by saying, "Is this good or bad?" Right? You simply desire it. This is a natural impulse in you, right? Whereas reason, on the other hand, when it takes into consideration uh, 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 certain ethical precepts, right? Presuppositions such as good, bad, um, what is just, what's unjust, what is detrimental, and what is not detrimental, whether it's to my body or to the human soul, and so forth. Now, this idea, this particular thesis, the idea that the soul is objectively constituted by three elements, and that these three elements exist independently of one another, this will prove to be essential, right? Now, why is this an essential statement? Because if we did not have a component of our so-called reason, then naturally we would not be able to discover the truth, nor would we be able to conceive of the truth, nor would we want to live in light of the truth. So this would kind of undermine the whole argument and so forth. So we all have this desire to live under the truth because we have our rational capacities. Now, how do we on this basis distinguish between different people? Well, simply because yes, everybody has this tripariate, this three-part component of the soul, right? Reason, ambition, and desire. It is common between all of us, right? However, we are not equal, right? So for some of us, this desire dominates, and for others, the desire, reason dominates, and for others, ambitions or desires dominate. Otherwise, if, for example, philosophers had reason and uh, merchants or guardians and so forth only had ambition and desire, then we would be talking about two different beings, right? We're no longer talking about human beings. We're talking about two different types of entities. And of course, this is not what Plato wants to argue, right? Now, again, the difference between individuals, this inequality is manifested in two ways. The first is that there are different levels of understanding, and the second is that there are different levels of self-discipline, meaning that some of us can discipline and control our soul better, desires and ambitions better than others. So, if we think of the guardians, right, the soldiers versus the artisans, clearly one of them needs to have more self-discipline than the other, right? The guardian cannot be thinking about what is aesthetic and what is beauty. The guardian in battle cannot be thinking about trade and what prices he ought to push for on the market, or how much he should sell this and this for that, right? There has to be a level of self-discipline. Similarly, the philosopher also needs to have a strong self-discipline. Why? Because he cannot let ambition and desire cloud reason, right? He cannot let it cloud reason. He needs to have access to reason that is unadulterated, right? Unfiltered, and so forth. So thus far, this is straightforward. So then for Plato, injustice arguably is when we treat everyone as being equal. Now, this does not mean that a group of people ought to be oppressed and another group of people ought to be elevated, to a higher level of living and so forth. So when Plato says that injustice is to equality is injustice, he is not saying here that the philosopher ought to live a life of luxury and pleasure and self-interest, whereas the other classes are somewhat lower classes who should not enjoy the privileges of material benefit and happiness and satisfaction. What he means is that it is unjust to take individuals who have a natural aptitude, who have a natural talent, and to kind of snip at their wings, so to speak, right? To try to reduce everyone to the level of same, or to paint everyone with the same brush. Why is this unjust? Because one, it is unnatural, and two, because it does not allow for an orderly function of society. An example of that would be if if we were to, let's say, 10 or 20 of us were to go into a marketing company and seeking out a position and so forth, and the managers essentially tells everybody, okay, each of you go to whatever department you would like, right? Obviously, this would create a sense of chaos, right? The natural, or what would be expected, is that we would be given tests, and according to our aptitudes, we would be placed in proper departments and proper places within the company so that there can be a functioning, harmonious whole. So Plato is essentially arguing the same thing, that look, the idea of equality is unjust, not just at the level of society, but at the level of the individual, because it does not allow the individual to flourish in the direction that he is naturally inclined towards and disposed to flourish, and uh, uh, he is not able to, and society is not able to flourish, because essentially people are not in their right place, right? This becomes a dysfunctional society. So this is what he means by inequality, right? And I point this not because I agree with it. I most certainly, I disagree on several things here, but just to point out that what he means by inequality is not what we talk about when we speak of inequality today, right? In the age of capital and wealth inequalities and income gaps in incomes and so forth, especially in Lebanon and so forth. And obviously, it goes without saying that uh, um, this is also different from modern day democracies, right, where each person has an equal vote, or individualism, which essentially states that each individual is an independent entity that ought to pursue his or her own self-interests and talents, and that the purpose of the state is not to maintain a division of labor, but to allow the individual to pursue his or her own trajectory and so forth. So now, what we have not discussed yet is how exactly does the philosopher king discover the idea of the truth, the question of epistemology. Now, there are two things to keep in mind, okay? First and foremost, what we just discussed, the idea of the soul, and the idea that the soul possesses reason. And 3, most importantly, that there is an objective, there is a world of ideals, a world of forms, perfect forms, which the philosopher can pierce into, can transcend and enter into. This will be our discussion on Thursday as a transition to talking about Saint Augustine, who will build on these ideas, the ideas of Plato, and then modify them significantly. So I'll see you guys then.